once again, I'm really excited. It's good. Like, I go away and I just love being back with all of you. So it is good to be here. My name is Pastor Nathan Schultz. If you're new here, thankful that you are here sharing your time with us as well. So today, let's see. Okay, All Saints Day. If you grew up in like a Catholic or Lutheran tradition, it's kind of one of the hallmark days of the church year. Maybe you've had experience with it. If you don't, here's what we're kind of doing. It's a little bit goofy at times because this congregation is a little bit like maybe in the first 2/3 of their life, right? Let's be honest about that. Sometimes, like if you're in the last third of life, this day takes on a new meaning. But we're going to get somewhere together. So All Saints Day is about God remembering us. It is about God remembering those who have died in Jesus. That means that those who have died trusting Jesus for their salvation. And this means that every nation, every tribe, every tongue is actually able to be saved because God is who he is, because of Jesus Christ. So today, we celebrate not just our memory of those who have died in Jesus, we celebrate God's memory, how he remembers us. So that's what we're doing All Saints Day. If you've ever been a part of a congregation that celebrates All Saints Day, people do it different ways. Sometimes there's the reading of a name, a Bible verse, and the toll of a bell. Maybe you've been a part of that. Or here at our church, and actually at Christ Memorial, we're one church in two places. This past week in the office, they were making a video, like an in memoriam type video, right? And people were sending photos in of their loved ones who had died in the last year. And they're going to be playing like a 6 to 7 minute video that actually helps us remember those who have died in Jesus Christ. Well, as I was thinking this week, we try to be one church together in two places, and I was like, I don't know if I want a bunch of 20 and 30-somethings watching, 6 minutes of people they have no idea who they are and had never met them. So we're not going to do the video today, but we are going to remember in some sense. But I didn't use the video because it has a weird kind of cultural understanding, if you've ever seen an in memoriam type of video. As I try to think of a cultural equivalent, I thought of like the Oscars, maybe? Does anybody watch award shows anymore? Do you? Yeah, a little bit. Like, so I know ratings are dropping and plummeting for these award shows, but at some point in the award show, let's say the Oscars, there's like an in memoriam video. And you remember every kind of person that has died in the last year. What's interesting about this video that the Oscars put together is there is a room somewhere, some corporate meeting where they decide who makes the cut to be in that video, right? You ever think about that? Like some guys sitting around being like, did they do enough to warrant like 4 seconds of screen time on national TV? You ever think about that? And so they actually decide who gets into the video, and I thought maybe they would just say, well, we're only going to include those who have won an Oscar in the past. That's not the case, though. And so now the floodgates open. There's all kinds of debate of who's accomplished enough, who has the achievements, who's worthy to be in the in memoriam video. Now, inexplicably, every single year, you will find the internet in an uproar because someone got left off. Through my Google search, I learned that the most recent conflict was Luke Perry. He was left off. Okay, I'm looking at people I expected to know the name, right? He's of 90210 fame, right? I say fame because I don't know what that means anymore. But Luke Perry, everyone got angry that he wasn't included. 90210 was apparently in the 90s good enough that even in 2021 he should have been included. But in some sense, there was a room where they decided Luke Perry didn't make the cut. He didn't do enough to be remembered. So take that cultural moment, the in memoriam video, and then consider what it would look like to take everyone who has died in a church community in the last year and then put them up on a screen. I had a weird experience with this as a child. I had a really mean Sunday school teacher in 3rd grade. And I remember one All Saints Day in my later teen years, his name was up there. And this man had done actual crazy things, had said bad things to us in our Sunday school. And part of my mind was we could have cut him out, right? My dad was a pastor. The guy was a pain in my dad's backside too. But yet, he showed up in the in memoriam. Something about people, ordinary, everyday people, who didn't have the resumes, the accomplishments, who didn't have the long list of achievements, even those people, because they have died in Jesus Christ, we will remember. But then if you see someone in that video who made you mad at a voters meeting or ticked you off, you start to wonder. And maybe All Saints Day isn't about our ability to remember. It's not about our idea of having a memory of those who have died. But maybe what we are celebrating today is God's memory. We are celebrating how it is God is able to remember his people. And so today, wherever you are, what stage of life, we are celebrating God's ability to remember you. See, because God actually goes to great lengths to try to communicate how good his memory is. He goes to great lengths actually speaking through his word in Scripture that we read from, and he uses people like prophets to actually tell you how good God's memory actually is. And we read from the prophet Isaiah, and prophets say hard things. They say things people aren't ready to hear. Sometimes they communicate what is hard and we know in our gut, but we don't have language to communicate. But this prophet cries out something that maybe we also have felt. It says that God's people said, "The Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me." We don't have to go too deep in ourselves to think of a time where we have experienced this idea that God has forgotten us. Immense suffering, there's death in the family, there's a relationship that ended, a hope or a dream that died and didn't come to fruition, and immediately when we go through these things, we think, God has forgotten me. Well, God's people at the time, too, they might have actually had some reason to feel forgotten by God. They experienced death and wandering in their life. They were in what we call exile, which means they didn't have the political leaders they want. Much of their life was spent walking around, wandering, living in lands that were not their own, and they were waiting to hear God's voice. They were waiting to hear God say something. And they were at his mercy. And yet somehow in little ways, God would give them little pieces so they would know that they were not forgotten, but it just wasn't enough. And because God has a good memory and he remembers his people, this is what the prophet says. Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Now, maybe this is a difficult image if you haven't had a child or brothers or sisters you remember, but this idea that God, like a mother who would nurse her child, that there was a connection, that there was a life-giving connection to a child, that without the mother, the child would be on its own and left to, well, all kinds of terrible things. But as I was thinking about God describing himself in this way as a mother who would nurse a newborn, I had a friend remind me that there are times when moms are just super tired and just actually forget. I'm looking out at this room and I'm maybe some moms actually have this experience. You're feeding a child and you just fall asleep or something. Or it gets even darker. My friend sent me hey, you know when moms actually forget their child in a hot car? And I'm whoa, let's not go there. That's a little bit too dark. But God is trying to say that how could a mother forget her child? And even if she did, I would not forget you. See, Jesus tells a story in the New Testament. It's called a parable. He says that there's this unrighteous judge, this jerk of a judge, and there's a woman who's crying out to him for justice and mercy. And she just keeps bothering the judge, and the judge wants nothing to do with her. And then finally the judge relents and says, fine, I'll do what you've been asking me. And God says, or Jesus says, you know what? If a bad judge can yet give mercy, how much more mercy would a good father offer to you? God has a good memory. He does not forget you, so much so that he gives us another image. He says this, behold, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. My first gut instinct was like a bad kind of like a bunch of men together like branding one another or something. Like, I don't know if that still happens. There's always like on bad videos on the internet, but this idea of like carving a name into your hand so that there's a scar that you could never forget that person. And see, God says he will not forget you, but here's the beautiful part about this. God has hands. I don't know if you thought about this, but God actually has hands because Jesus Christ of Nazareth has hands. And actually, in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we see that Jesus' hands take quite a beating. We see that it's actually in the crucifixion that his hands have markings on them, so that in those markings, you would actually find yourself and not be forgotten. So that in the wounds and the pain of Jesus, you would know that in those wounds, you would be found and you would not be forgotten. See, because this is actually how the story of the cross plays out, is that even while Jesus is dying, suffering the worst that humanity could offer, even yet he's thinking of other people. He looks to a disciple and says, take care of your mother. You heard this story that there was a thief next to him, and the thief cries out and says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, yeah, I got a good memory. Today you'll be with me in paradise. Or maybe it's this idea that Jesus on the cross, even while suffering, has such a good memory that he remembers that all those below him on the cross need forgiveness. And he cries out and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. See, God has a very good memory because Jesus has hands. You find yourself in the wounds of Jesus' hands and find yourself forgiven and even remembered. But it kind of brings up another question. How, if I am going to be remembered, how will I be remembered? How will I be remembered? I think for some of us, we would wish to be like in the background or kind of just keep a low profile, you know? Like, it's kind of fine if I'm not really known. I can just kind of get through life. How will I be remembered? Maybe it's just I want to be kind of underneath the scenes. But something I found is if you ask the question, how will I be remembered, you might be trying to do all kinds of things to try to control how you will be remembered. You'll move to new cities away from your family. You'll try to get high-level degrees and job titles that will prove you are something. You will live in new places with new relationships so that maybe you can control the narrative of how you will be remembered. But the truth is that you actually won't be able to control how you will be remembered. You won't be able to control how you will be remembered. This hit me last weekend when I was away at a wedding for a friend who I was friends with all the way from preschool through high school, even into college. And she got married, but I saw old friends back from my hometown. And if you know anything, if you return to your hometown, people will like tell stories about you that you forgot and actually wish you could forget. Do you know this? And so my wife was not yet there. She was flying in Friday night after the rehearsal dinner. But one of my friends just brought up, like, Nathan, remember when you dated that girl? I was like, whoa, what the heck, man? Like, chill out. I didn't want to be reminded of that relationship. Or like, oh, Nathan was so funny when he dressed up this one day at Spirit Week. And I was like, oh, that was not my brightest moment. You know, it's going to happen in a couple weeks for many of you. You're going to go home to your family, and you're going to run into like an aunt who thinks you still love like cross country, even though you stopped running 4 years ago. You're going to bring a boyfriend or girlfriend home, and guess what? You're not actually going to get to control what stories get told to them, right? We ask these questions of how will I be remembered, and it's honestly humbling because I think we will be remembered in less than ideal ways if we're honest with ourselves. So I have some advice for you. So two things I want to tell you of how to control how you'll be remembered. So before you die, write a really good obituary. Yeah, list everything you've ever done, every accomplishment, every achievement. List all the people you were friends with, list the high-profile people, and then tell a couple friends who are going to give eulogies what to say at your funeral. Control how people will remember you. But even that might not work. So what you could do next is you could hire like a chaplain or another pastor to just only tell good stories about you, right? Pick one who doesn't really know you, but you could just write down 3 good stories and they'll tell that at the funeral. Well, I came across, actually, through a group called Mockingbird, one such story of a chaplain who had a job. He was a chaplain at a hospital in Las Vegas, and his entire job, he said, was to do funerals for people who had died in hospice care but didn't have another pastor. And he said he got so good at doing funerals that he had almost like a Mad Lib kind of situation laid out. And he said he could go to the family, he could talk with them for 5 minutes, about half an hour before the funeral service, and he could get these stories and he could weave these good stories about what a great person they were all together, and then he could say something generic about God's love, and everyone would turn back smiling. He tells one story of being asked. He knew a man for about 4 hours in hospice who had died, and he says he went up there and told that story about how he was swinging the golf club with Jesus up on a pillowy cloud, or some kind of generic good story about a man. Well, he describes a moment where he finished telling the stories about this man, and then he goes to his seat, but then another pastor came up to him after. Actually, a pastor went up to preach their sermon, and I'll just share what he wrote in this reflection. He said, "But right after my act, the real preacher that morning stood up and addressed the congregation. You know he was an addict, right?" Suddenly the room froze, and the celebration of life was over. "He stole from us. We tried to help him. You know our pain. You've been through it too." The pastor said this looking right at the family, and they nodded their heads solemnly. "But you know what? Today, that's okay. It's okay because we know that he died into grace." And the nods started to turn into verbal agreement. And the pastor continued, "And that's who grace is for. Grace is for the ones who drank it away, the ones who hid it, the ones who smoked it, the ones who stole it, the ones who slept with it, and the ones who lied about it." And the family, for the first time, felt in the death of their loved one that they were understood and heard. See, I don't think you're going to get to control how you will be remembered, but there is much good news in God's memory. There is much good news in how God will remember you. Somehow in Scripture, maybe you've been given this impression or this idea that God is this person who forgets the bad stuff you do, right? We have verses like, "As far as the east is from the west, so your sin is kind of cast away." Or he even says, "I will remember their iniquity no more." And as I was thinking about this, I thought to myself, is there any comfort in a God who is forgetful? Like maybe we just need God to forget our sin and put it away. And I was wondering, is there any comfort in a God who has a forgetful memory, who forgets my sin? Or maybe forgets the things I would rather not be remembered? And I decided this last week that I really didn't find much comfort in a forgetful God. I didn't find much comfort in a God just glossing over and pretending that there were things that I'd rather not remember about myself. Now, because in glossing over, I learned that the things that I don't want to remember about myself and the things I've done wrong, I actually can't forget them. I can't forget the things that I would rather not remember about myself. And so there is good news in God's memory, that he does not just forget your sin, but he remembers something much better. He remembers his Son. He remembers that salvation was brought to you because this God the Father gave up his Son unto death, not to condemn you, but to save you. Not to be angry with you and judge you or seek revenge, but to actually love you. And that actually God would not just forget what you had done wrong, but in those moments would remember what Jesus has done for you. See, it's actually so much better news. Because if God remembers you and you try to think, if I just did enough good, if I just did enough to clean up my life, maybe God will remember the good things of my life and not the bad things I'd rather not remember at all. But instead what you see is a God who loves you because he remembers his Son. He remembers you not in your worst moments, but in Jesus' worst moment. He remembers you according to the scars on his hands. He remembers you because on a cross with the nails pierced through his hands, your name is found in those wounds. See, you don't want a forgetful God. You want a God who remembers something much better. See, because this is what we're celebrating on All Saints' Day. We will remember people who had great examples of faith and loved us dearly, but ultimately we are remembering what God knows. We are remembering those who have died in Jesus. That God regards them and remembers them not according to what they've done or done wrong or even done right, but according to what Jesus has done for them. There's much good news in the memory of God. So we'll celebrate All Saints' Day, knowing that you too, whether in the first 2/3 of your life or the last third, will be found and remembered in Jesus Christ. Amen.